there are archetypes in us that are like talents, or they vary in strength, and they act through us whether we know it or not. And if they are acceptable, then we blossom. But what if what you have in you is an archetype that is not welcomed in your particular family or culture? Then you're caught between two. We all are between two, the archetypes in us and the projections and expectations on us.
As storytellers, we have always used myths and archetypes as tools to deepen our human experience. Ancient folks used symbols and cave paintings. Although some may argue that we are living at a time where there is an absence of myth, the truth is we still use different mediums to make sense of our world, be it literature, art, or even TV shows. How about our personal lives? How are you showing up and experiencing your life? Do you often wonder what type of mythological character you embody?
Welcome back to the Soulspace podcast. We are your hosts, Adrian and Thal. On this episode, we have a conversation with Jean Shinoda Bolen, a psychiatrist, Jungian analyst, and an internationally known author and speaker. If you haven't already, we highly recommend you read her books, Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man. These are very user-friendly ways to better understand the various parts of our deep psyches. We talked to Jean about how to find purpose in the second half of life, archetypes that are found in every person, and how children carry the unlived parts of their parents. It is our pleasure to bring you Jean Shinoda Bolen.
So, are we being recorded as of right now, or what? What do we do?
Yeah, so we are officially recording, but we can officially welcome you to the show. So thank you for coming on to our podcast.
Thank you.
Well, it's an adventure always to have a potential depth conversation with people who are interested in such things. And I never know where the conversation will go. And I often feel that in such conversations, words come out that have never come out before and link things together. So there's an energy field between people. I know in my office as a Jungian analyst, the geometry of the space is like two equal chairs, and in between, and the invisible in between, is really the largest self or soul. It's a soul space essentially, and a creative space, because again, it's a conversation between two people, but it's different than what you and I are doing, because what I do in my office is the other person provides the information and the dreams and the thoughts and the angst and the losses, and I receive and comment and back and forth. So I'm hoping that out of this intriguing sounding program you have, Soulspace, I actually responded to that. I thought, I know about different varieties of Soulspace. Let's see where this conversation takes us.
Well, it's a real honor. When I reached out on email, I didn't know, how busy you might be and whether you'd agree to come on. So this is a real honor for both of us to have this conversation with you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe I'm thinking actually right now, what I would love to hear from you is actually how your journey began. I'm really curious what you were like as a young girl and how that evolved into just early in your career, and how your path brought you towards the work that you've done, the books that you've, written and your current life. So just the early experiences. And I know it might be difficult to kind of condense the story, but I'd love to hear some of that.
Well, some of it comes to me quite easily because I have been working on a memoir-based book, which means I've thought about some of these questions that you raised. And my ancestry is Japanese American. Both of my parents are born in the United States of Japanese ancestry. So when World War II broke out, every person of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast was to be rounded up and put into relocation camps or concentration camps. I had very good parents who knew something about making choices and going on paths that needed to be going on. And my father and mother then worked to get us out of the state of California ahead of the martial law that Japanese Americans came under. And consequently, I wasn't put in a concentration camp. They are referred to that. They were called relocation camps. But basically, they were camps in the desert with armed guards and hastily built tar and wood and paper barracks, really. So instead, I left the state and we went to New York, to Gardens, to Grand Junction, Colorado, to Blackfoot, Idaho, to Denver during the war years, and returned back to California as soon as it was possible to come back. And that meant the war was over. Well, what this has done on many different levels is that one becomes as you might be as apparently Asians in Canada. And yet there's this place of being, of the words I came across in becoming a psychiatrist somewhere along the line is the idea of positive marginality. That you can be with other people who are not like you, and yet you're not marginalized in the negative way. Because I was this upbeat kid always. I came in privileged to be loved and privileged to, well, just come in maybe with a sunny disposition. So I became, in going from elementary school to elementary school during the war years, I was accepted, and yet I was different. And so the consequences is that you kind of be in the space of positive marginality, in which you then are able to see much more clearly, because you don't just drop into being unconscious with everybody. You actually are aware that you are different, and yet it's perfectly acceptable. And the differences help you to make your way and to appreciate what acts on you and what is in you. And actually that's a way into describing something about why I would have the vision I have of that there are archetypes in us that are like talents, or they vary in strength, and they act through us whether we know it or not. And if they are acceptable, then we blossom. But what if what you have in you is an archetype that is not welcomed in your particular family or culture? Then you're caught between two. We all are between two, the archetypes in us and the projections and expectations on us. And essentially what the work of depth analysis is to find out from what the dreams are saying, from what your life has taught you so far, something about who you really are. And that combination of who you are inside and what you were expected to be outside being the conflicts that created growth experiences or real difficulties.
It's very interesting when you mention positive marginality. I'm someone that comes from different backgrounds, African, Middle Eastern, a Muslim. And I've been going through my own Jungian analysis the past 2 years. And I've been thinking about those things and reading your books and just thinking about Jungian analysis and how it can also help people who are marginalized, but that there are not a lot of people that have explored that path that are from my background. So just listening to you is so reaffirming. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, Jean, so which archetypes for you were emerging that maybe didn't play nicely with the surroundings when you were growing up? You talked about possible friction or conflict. Were there any that come to mind?
Well, the archetype that has been my strongest one is Artemis. And Artemis is the goddess of the goddess with a bow and arrow and the moon. I mean, she's the goddess of the hunt and the goddess of the moon. And she is really the goddess of sisterhood. She's the only goddess that all of her mythologies has a great deal to do with what the women's movement is up to, really, because she looked after young girls. And during the time that they were under the protection of Artemis, they could be free like an Artemis girl. They didn't conform to early marriage and things for that 1 year that they were under her protection, after which they had to live up to conformity and all of that. But Artemis is the kid who starts out with this an innate watching, say, boys allowed to do things that girls cannot do. The Artemis puts her hands on her hips, so to speak, at 4 years old and says, "It's not fair." There's a sense of equality. There's a sense of competency that is pretty innate in an Artemis person who also likes to go off the beaten path and has an innate sense of nature. I was realizing what a privilege it is to appreciate nature. I was just in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and every time I go there, I think I should come here more often, because there's something about nature there, the sky, the vastness of the sky, and the quality of the air and the panoramic views that are, for me, it's a soul energy field. As where I live, I'm talking to you right now and looking out over the bay. I live on the south side of Mount Tamalpais, north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's beautiful. And there's something about the archetypes that respond to beauty. And this is another one. This is Aphrodite, who is mostly known for being the goddess of love and beauty in ancient classical mythology, but as patriarchy got more and more judgmental about women and women's sexuality, she went from what was considered she was considered awesome and revered. Now, you don't usually think of Aphrodite as revered, but in ancient days she was. And as goddess of love and beauty, it was not just sensuality of the body, but it was appreciation of the sensuality of the world. Beauty in general, moved by beauty. Not everybody is moved by beauty, but if you have the archetype in you, you are. And what happens with an archetype is you drop deeper into your soul space. That's what the archetype does. Otherwise, you live, in Jungian terms, there's the persona. That's the face you wear into the world. And that is what needs to be acceptable to many families and cultures. So can you wear a persona that works? Well, I was able to do that. I didn't come up against, I was well brought up, so I behaved myself. So, and didn't innately just live from my archetype, as some people might get into trouble with that as well. So archetypes in us are patterns. Like every talent that's a human talent. And not everybody has the same amount of artistic talent or or mechanical talent or athletic talent. They vary. They're gifts. So I think of archetypes as basically as similar to the gifts that we come into, and we either have an opportunity to develop them or we don't, depending on the possibilities of family and culture.
I think this is very important for us to understand. As we had approached you, we're coming from this new generation, and there's a lot of clashes that are coming up everywhere. So you talking about the role of myths and archetypes and helping us to drop in deeper and understanding ourselves better. I mean, even considering all the current resurgence in feminism and a lot of sort of reactionary behavior, which a lot of it is also coming out of wounds that have not been not understood or not addressed. So how can we integrate mythology back into our lives?
The archetypes are patterns, human patterns in us. They conform to mythology in many ways, but they exist without us knowing any mythology whatsoever. It's what you know deeply in yourself that's true for you. And such things as, what are you doing when you lose track of time? What are you involved in when you are so absorbed in whatever it is that it seems like 3 hours have passed like 20 minutes, or 20 minutes has dropped you into a timeless zone? I mean, there's something about only the person who lives in you can know what truly deeply feeds your spirit, what is a soul space. And they are related to the archetypes. And the sense in Jungian psychology is, first, if there is that persona that many mothers are especially concerned about, that their kids go out in the world and are well brought up, acceptable, etc., which helps the child to navigate the early world. But persona is the layer in in theater. There used to be in ancient Greece the smiling face and the frowning face, representing the faces of and they used to put on masks and go onto the stage. A persona is a mask of sorts, and if you have a persona that really reflects you, then what you inside, and the mask is not mask-like. But if you have to conform to a culture or a family that expects certain things of you, no matter what, then you create a persona that is not exactly who you are. And the more you identify with a persona, the more distant you get from what you are inside. So there's persona, then there's ego, and that's the part of us that makes choices and speaks from the word I. And then there's the deeper level of the archetypes, especially the archetype that has to do with spirit or soul, or what Jung called the archetype of the self. See, human beings do seem to have an affinity for divinity, essentially. That there is something in the human being that has worshipped forever. As far as back as we can see images in caves from thousands of years ago. I was just learning a bit about Mot, the ancient Egyptian goddess, and they go back thousands of years before the Greek goddesses. And it seems as if human beings have had a sense of awe, and then from that worship. And then the question about you, whatever it is that is divinity, is so much broader than a human mind can wrap around, that somebody will have a genuine experience of divinity and then think that experience is the experience. And then if it's a powerful male running something or other, you have a patriarchal religion that says this is what God is. And one of the interesting things about words and all is that when you own the words, someone can have experience of divinity and not consider that it was until much, much later. Because when they were growing up, God was defined as this. And the idea even of goddess, that there's a feminine aspect of divinity, not in many religions. So what do you do with the experience that you have inside when the world outside has no words for it? One of the things is, the more you have words for something, the more you can feel it growing in you. And I had my own life trajectory has a lot to do with coming in touch with a sense of whatever God is, and feeling the mystery of it. I mean, interestingly, the word mystery, it comes from the word mystes, which in ancient Greece was the word of the initiate who entered the Eleusinian mysteries and had a sense of a goddess, actually, then no longer feared death. And that is one of the things that actually does seem to happen to people, especially as they grow older and connect with soul inside and a sense of divinity outside, that it doesn't seem to be that, okay, well, there's something on the other side. That there, and this is the basis of all religions, mostly all religions. And so each of us has accessibility to this. We don't need a particular gatekeeper, which most of the religions seem to feel and insist that they are the gatekeepers. They are the only way to the truth. When built into each of us is our own ability to experience depth and soul and love, for example. I remember when explaining things to little children, how do you explain God? Well, how is it that they know the word love? If you say God is love, oh, that seems to be much more easy to grasp. And yet that is just as difficult to describe to someone who doesn't know it as it would be to describe God.
Yeah, that was beautiful. A lot of things come to mind when you were just saying that. I think it was Michael Meade where I heard him talk about the pathless path and how at some point we have to drop whatever maps that were helpful initially and go on our own individual quest. What would you offer as guidance, perhaps, for a lot of young seekers who are maybe self-initiated, finding themselves in times of transition and kind of confused, and overwhelmed, to be honest, with the information overload that we have with the internet and access to, as much knowledge as we want. How do we receive guidance and make sure that we're discerning? I think discernment is part of that question too.
Well, the Greeks had two words for knowledge, logos, meaning the mental apparatus, the intelligence, and gnosis, spelled with a G, like gnosis, but pronounced gnosis. And gnosis is what you know in your bones, or what you know at the soul level, which is some kind of inner certainty or inner compass that says, oh, I feel at home here. I trust this person. And often you need to find some blessed solitude, actually. That's how you kind of find your way. And one of the things about current culture is the bombardment of emails, and there's hardly any time, unless you choose it, to be by yourself or by yourself in nature. And conversations, who is it that you're comfortable with without words? Where do you go to find peace? Where is your soul space? Now that's a gnosis thing. The intelligent mind will, can give you options and things, but only when you get to a place that feels safe, home, peaceful, and then you stay in it. I mean, the meditation helps people who otherwise wouldn't even create a space, but it's also very natural for for us unless we have some heavy judgment in our head. And then the idea of concentrated meditation often allows a person to be in a space without the critic or the judge or the whatever that makes internal comfort difficult. So there's gnosis. There's trusting what we know in our bones about what really matters.
This is definitely an important reminder. It's like tuning into our internal compass to guide us.
That's true. And the poetic side of us is the gnosis side, by the way. Mm-hmm. It's right brain, left brain. And left brain knows a lot, and it has details in it. But it's poetry that speaks to what we know inside at a soul level. And so when I heard that Mary Oliver had died, it did really feel that I had let a friend had died. Now, I'd seen her in person in San Francisco when she first made her first trip out of her life in Massachusetts, and she read some of her poetry, and she was interviewed on stage. So I did have a sense of her in person, but mainly I knew her through her poems. And every once in a while, there are words that come from her poetry that just is such soul knowledge. There was one poem in which she wrote, and I may be paraphrasing because I didn't set out to memorize her poems. It's more that they sort of sunk in, and so I can have access to some of the lines that really have meant something to me. But one that said, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk through the desert for 100 miles repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves." Now, what is that? What is that trusting, knowing, not confused part of us that we came into this world with, and we got it diverted by so many dysfunctional families and dysfunctional cultures, and especially for boys more than girls, are trained to not be vulnerable. Girls, we make friendships through our vulnerability and from sharing things. Boys don't. And so they're much more apt to be cut off from the poetic side of their souls. Or if they're smart enough, they know to keep it sacred and not share it because somebody will belittle or them or will make fun of them. So they learn something about with whom can they share their soul space, and often it is with a woman. Or if it's a gay man with finally meeting another who has a soul space much as his own. So there is that, and then I'm remembering in one of my books, Crossing to Avalon, I have a poem by Mary Oliver written right. The whole poem is right in the middle of it. And it's the one that is called The Journey. And it begins, "One day you finally knew what you had to do and began." That is when you start your individuation journey. When you listen to the inner compass. And I'm remembering also a quote from a man who rose to the top of his corporate work. He became head of Newsweek when Newsweek was very popular. And he wrote a line that said, he talked about the ladder that he climbed to the top, and he got to the top of the ladder. He was made editor-in-chief of Newsweek. And he said, "I found the ladder had been put up against the wrong wall." You know, because climbing a ladder is sort of like going on a journey. And then there is the end of the poem in Blackwater Woods, in which Mary Oliver says, "To live in this world, you must learn to do 3 things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones as if your life depends upon it, and when it comes time to let it go, to let it go." That is real depth soul, and psychological wisdom. And what I have been doing workshops the past couple of years, I haven't, it's not on my schedule right now, but I took a line from a poem called A Summer Day, in which she ends up saying, "Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And I've taken the phrase, your one wild and precious life, as a way to describe, being on your soul path, individuating, living the life you were meant to live. With wild being what you came in with. I mean, wild is like a forest, a virgin forest. Nobody has logged it. Wild is your natural instinctual self. And so when you are in your second half of life, especially, and you've lived the life that you were supposed to live and either succeeded at it or failed at it, I don't know, but by the second half of life, it's when you start to wonder what really matters to you, and will you have the courage to follow your heart. And courage comes from the word kuar, meaning heart. And that goes back to what was innately you. That's the wild part. What will you do with your one wild? Or you could say archetypal. That would fit too. Your one archetypal, wild and precious. Precious is something you also have to really value, that who you are and the energy you have and the time you have and the words you use. This is all you have. Time goes by so fast. You really get to know it as you get older. It's zip. And you get to where you wonder, how did I get this old so fast? That happens to be where I am right now. How did I get to be this old? I became, I was born in 1936, so I'm 80. I don't like that. And yet there's a perspective on this.
Mm. It's just amazing listening to you. You've led such a soulful life, so it's so inspiring for us. Just listening to you talk. But you bringing up poetry is so important because I've always felt that there is a poet in all of us. And when I was younger, I started writing poetry. I published some poetry, but then I started the academic path, and I have a degree in English literature, my master's, and I found that sort of the academic path moved me away from my soul writing, and now
right.
And now that I'm in my hopefully individuating in the path of healing, I'm going back to poetry and hopefully integrating that side of myself.
When you listen, as I do as an analyst, to someone telling me something that's deeply meaningful and true to them, and they have a vocabulary such as you would have with your academic background, it's what comes out is like poetry because it's so true and it unedited. I mean, we all tend to edit our stories as we tell someone else. But when you're in analysis and you've reached a deep place and you're talking from your soul level about how awful it was or how deep it was or what the loss was like, it is like listening to a poet. Now, I need to wave and stop for a moment because it says low battery.
Okay.
I need to go get a plug.
Sure.
No problem.
Okay, it's plugged in now. I didn't think it would run out of juice, but it, did.
It's okay.
That's a good catch. No, maybe it's just the charge that we're, coming through our conversation. Yeah. Jean, you talked about young boys. I mean, I can't help but, really was listening to you carefully there about growing up in modern society, and how we're often encouraged not to be in our bodies, the feeling body, and be receptive to this poetic language. And so for me, this is a very new territory, just within the last year, maybe 2 years, to really explore the sensual aspects of being, dropping out of my mind and the intellect, but not to demonize it, right? Recognizing that's been a gift along the way. I'd love to hear you talk about the embodied spirituality. I mean, the New Age movement has brought, lots of different versions of spiritual life. And I feel like there's something very important about highlighting the embodied spiritual path.
Well, part of us, we get to be so out of touch with depth of body, and the depth of body being not only having feelings, but like the heart is usually considered in the body, certainly, and yet there's the heart chakra, or the heart center, which is in the same general area as the physical heart. But the more you understand and feel in your body what that heart chakra is responding to, you learn something about what really matters to you, and you're moved by it. And over years, what happens is that you either constrict it and lose touch with what is meaningful to you, or you find it being like a receiver that grows over time, that becomes larger because you can love more, you can feel more, you can have a sense of connection with more that is. So that's an embodied part of us. But when you go out into the world as a little girl or a little boy, and especially if your family expects you to be an extension of themselves and not who you are, that's where things really get into difficulties. Because if you are supposed to be living out the unlived part of a parent, or to be socially acceptable because it's a tight issue for them, then as you go out into the world, you need to conform to be that person. And if you're a little girl or a little boy, it's like there are certain qualities that if you're an extension of some hope for, if you're a cute little girl, then that may be really emphasized. Or if you're a bright little boy, that might be really emphasized. And then you enter a culture of school. And school is interesting because when you go into kindergarten or first grade, and there is a difference between the schoolyard and inside the schoolroom. And especially the little boys. The bigger boys that are a year, 2 years ahead of you are bigger and stronger. And they have, especially if they come from homes in which they have been bullied, what kids do, boy kids especially, is they turn around and they identify with the aggressor at home by beating up on little boys who they can beat up on. And so a little boy with some sense of what you need to do to manage on the schoolyard learns about you go along to get along. Mm. And so that's why you have like boys watching the bully pick on a kid and nobody speaks up. Because you don't want to be identified with the kid who's being made fun of. And you just might, And this pattern of actually is sort of feels difficult to sort of call that patriarchy, but it is. It's exactly the same as later on. I mean, I saw the movie Vice recently about Dick Cheney and the kinds of things that went along in Washington, D.C., and it was like bullies beating up on weaker people, and the culture of the schoolyard begins that story where the boy learns to go along to get along, to not challenge authority. And what happens is, if the little boy kept saying things that were not welcomed, he often feels a lack of worth as he grows up too. And one of the things that little boys seem to have difficulty with is saying the truth about how they really feel about something. Fortunately, often they can do that at home with some families. They also, if they can have a good friend, I think it's very hard to be kind of just one of the kids without a really good friend going through elementary school. For girls as well. And yet, it is through, the question is, if you have suffered as a child, and nobody gets through life without suffering, you'll get your share of suffering all along the way, but when you do, will it grow you? And will it grow you to have more compassion for other people and for yourself? Or do you deny it and want to disidentify with anybody who is suffering something that you suffered from in the past?
All that you're saying is so deep, is resonating deeply within us, really. And you talk about the young boy and the young girl. I realize that part of my healing is to heal the feminine within me, but it's also to heal the masculine. I know that it's using dualistic language when I say feminine and masculine, but the truth is, they're inseparable. To heal the feminine is to heal the masculine, and to heal the masculine is to heal the feminine. I mean, if I would love to hear what you think about that.
There's an interesting concept in Jungian psychology of that, the tension of opposites. That the reason for often describing masculine and feminine as being separate and different is to be able to kind of label qualities. Human beings seem to like to label things, but they're all part of the continuum of being a human person, essentially. So what is allowed on that big continuum? What Jung described as masculine and feminine in the unconscious, he called anima and animus. When you're a girl who, girls these days are able to become whole people much easier than boys, at least in the United States or North America. So education is so important, and competition. I remember when my daughter went out for soccer at 8 years old. That's a different, for teaching a little girl how to play soccer, play as a team member, play competitively. She is learning something about physicality, about teamwork, and about the will to win, which is usually considered animus or male side. And education itself develops the whole left brain. And the more she goes up the education ladder and develops that side of herself and gets some authority through that, the more she is. It isn't her, like there's a place where you think, listen, it's not my animus that's doing the thinking. I am thinking clearly myself. Because you understand what the animus is when it takes you over, when it's not who you are, when you are being defensive or something, and you get out of relationship with the person you're talking to because you really have been, it's been stimulated. So then you are in your animus. I used to recognize, and recognizing, don't do it as much, when I'm in my animus versus when I'm just being me, thinking clearly. Even though that is not probably my primary. I think I'm more a feeling type than a thinking type, but the thinking type really gets educated along the way. You cannot get through all the education I've had without really doing justice to the thinking type, and then it happens to be who you become rather than some autonomous part of you taking you over. That's one of the things that are of value, to have an understanding of a concept that you could actually watch happening in yourself rather than watch happening in somebody else. But you can see it happening in someone else when they're centered, when you're centered, and when something prods another part of you to come out, and you behave in such a way that if you fortunately have enough observing ego that you realize it's happened, at least afterwards, you can learn to change how you are behaving, because you don't happen to like that way of behaving.
Thank you. That's amazing. I'm starting to slowly recognize when my animus is triggered. It's pretty ugly.
Yeah, you mentioned for females, it might actually be easier in today's society to be more whole. Can you expand on that a little bit? I'm actually curious. So, how is it possibly more challenging for males growing up in patriarchy, type of a culture?
It's because of the issues of power, and it being part of a culture. Basically, though the women's movement and the education of women have made many parts of the world much more egalitarian in what a woman can aspire to and accomplish, this is fairly new. And meanwhile, on the other side, the gender with power have been men, and so that's been patriarchal. Well, patriarchy is hierarchical, and it's a sense of dominance. Who you have power over. It means that if you're young and new at any of this, and a guy, if there's any part of you that is what has been suppressed in somebody higher up, and you are showing what he sacrificed or judged badly and squashed in himself, he's going to squash it in you too. And so the diversity within a person gets acted on by the family, who can't look at it and only likes certain qualities. And culture says, if you meet the stereotype, if you're a boy who is naturally aggressive, who is extroverted, this is an extroverted culture. So if you introduce a new ball or a game to 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old little boys, it's the extroverted kid who goes right in, wants to learn about it, and the introverted boy stays on the sidelines and watches. And he's nudged. He said, "Oh, what's the matter with you? Why don't you go in and play?" But his natural ability, and it's true for the girl too, is, I want to see what the rules are. I want to understand the game, and I also want to figure out by watching whether I want even to play the game. But that is not acceptable in an extroverted culture. When if you wave your hand, I'll play, and you go in and you play well, and most of the games are pretty competitive, and you do well, then you really are a solid guy who's gotten a lot of accolades for being an aggressive little guy. And the quiet guy who is taking it all in and all doesn't receive. It's like, what's the matter? Are you shy? Being shy is not a very positive word, and yet the introvert has to be able to have some time out and time in order to develop that side. So that's some of the ideas of.
It's interesting when you talk about the extroverted, introverted, and again going back to the young boy and the young girl. I know I was brought up in a very patriarchal culture in the Middle East in the 80s, and I used to love to play soccer, and I got into so much trouble because of that. And now that I'm a mom and I have a son, I tried to get him into soccer, but he just didn't like it. he really refused, and I kept trying for a good 3 years. And he just does not like it. So, yeah.
Well, you're starting early to realize that what parents seem to want to do is to have their child be able to do those things.
Yes, absolutely.
You wanted to do as a child, and you've got a kid who has a sense of himself.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. The whole, it's what you had mentioned earlier too, the whole unlived life is really what started my inner journey, and reading, I think I can't remember his name, but reading a book on the shadow and parents carrying the unlived life and the children carrying that weight, really woke me up. So I don't even know if I have a question around that, but just hearing your thoughts is amazing, really.
Well, the writing side of my life it actually began with the Tao of Psychology, Synchronicity in the Self. But the book that went after that, called Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man, that followed, were the ones that it made it possible for somebody to read about and relate to a particular pattern which happens to have a Greek god or goddess name. And then there is an insight that says, oh, this is why I've had so much trouble with my father or my mother, or why I am who I am. And the idea of valuing who you are and not accepting the other choice, which is to conform to what it is your parents wanted you to do, up to a point. It actually is adaptable to conform up to a point. But then it's like you get to midlife, you've lived out the life you were supposed to. You see, you individuate earlier if you don't manage to do it just right the way your family wanted you to do. If you happen to be the archetype or the psychological type that fits the pattern in your first half of life, everybody says, good for you, And it's easy, except that you get to midlife and the sense is this all there is? Okay. I got my education, I've got a good job, I got married, I got kids. Is this all there is? Because I feel empty inside. Mm-hmm. And this is why Jungian work is often second half of life work. It's because there is a whole unlived out part. But then if you are non-conforming, you couldn't be the boy your father wanted you to be. You weren't the girl your mother or father wanted you to be. You were introverted in an extroverted family. I remember working with a young woman who was quite herself introverted, and she was in this large extroverted Italian family, and it was pretty difficult to be her. Mm. Or if you are interested in things, your family is all into sports and corporate advancement, and you are into the arts. Well, in certain families, that's okay, but in other families, you drop it. You don't follow. You don't do that which you naturally gravitate to, or you fight to do it. And when you fight to do it, you start to individuate early. If you cannot conform, which many gay boys have found true, they could not conform. They would have liked to have conformed, and some of them managed fairly well to conform. But if they didn't conform just to be who they were and have other people pick up on it, meant that they were bullied, meant that they felt terrible about themselves. Except that now the environment is changing. It's like for women in the 70s. For the first time, there was the first second women's movement, really. The first women's movement was 1848 when there was a whole issue about voting. Mm. But it was really in the late 60s and 70s that the women's movement that we know of was people like Gloria Steinem coming in and seeing and expressing and then opening the doors for women to do what has been unacceptable before, you could do now. Mm-hmm. So the world has, in many places, is a bigger world where we can grow into more of who we are. And we can make more mistakes, too. This is what happens to people also. When you have choice, you also can make mistakes. Mm-hmm. Or not. Maybe they were just... I like to use the labyrinth as a model for the path, not a straight line. And in the labyrinth, you think you're moving towards your goal, and then, oops, there's a U-turn. Hmm. There was a block. There was a pain. There was a loss. Well, you're still on the path. And what will come next keeps shaping you.
These are very important things to listen to, especially for our generation, because we've been brought up to just, everything is so goal-oriented. Once we are on the path, when am I going to become enlightened, or when am I going to know myself better? So keeping that in mind is very important.
Well, it's important to remember when you've had it's like if you can hold on to the best of each of the stages you've gone through. You start out holding on to the kid self that had a sense of wonder. You can hold on to wonder and take in a new experience or a person or something with a sense of wonder. And then you go into adolescence where there really is a lot of idealism in adolescence. Can you hold on to that? And the maturity that comes later, and the wisdom that comes along the way. The whole integrated person has an inner child, an inner adolescent, an inner masculine, an inner feminine, an inner wise person, a connection with divinity, however you define it. And with that part of divinity, you have a sense, first of all, if you have a sense of soulfulness in yourself, you have a deep sense that you matter. At some level, there is something called grace, there's something called divinity, there's something called mysticism that you have experienced, and you have been blessed, and all you can do is say thank you. And as soon as you have a sense of gratitude, of privilege, that I now see that, relative to the other kids in my family, or when you meet people who were disadvantaged, and you start to realize that you've been privileged. You have no reason to feel superior. You have more reason to have gratitude. This starts to be soul-shaping as well. And it could be that the whole work we have, if we come into this world as a soul, and I think we do. I think we are spiritual beings on a human path, rather than human beings who may or may not go on a spiritual path. So we come into the world as a spiritual being in a helpless little baby body into our version of dysfunctional family, in our version of dysfunctional society, and somehow this life that goes by so fast must be a major, major opportunity to grow soulfully, to make a difference to others, to do something that makes you feel that you are doing what you came for. I mean, that sense of rightness when you are doing something that you know is being true to who you are inside. There is that, you can't, it isn't a sustained thing, but you dip into it and you feel, oh, this is who I am. This is what I came for. I am living my own soul journey, which you talked in a Joseph Campbellian way. You're living a personal myth, and you are being true to it. And that's a shorthand way of saying what individuation is about. Jung uses so many technically sounding words like individuation and animus and stuff, but underneath it all is such a deep valuation of what it's like to be human and the opportunities we have to be human. maybe especially now, the responsibilities of being human. When I think about how I went through the nuclear stuff earlier, when it seemed like people were right on the verge of pushing the button. Well, there are a lot more nuclear weapons in the world now than then. But now we're looking at the environmental crisis, which could end it for us as well. And so if you come into the world as a human being during a time of crisis, the responsibilities or the opportunities to make a difference are much greater. And for now to be a woman at this time in history is both an opportunity and a responsibility. Like, my major activism is to support feminism within the United Nations, to have a 5th Women's World Conference, and I now have a sense that it will not be sponsored necessarily at all by the UN, but they will come into it, but it'll be created in India in 2022. So I've had these buttons out saying 5WCW India 2022, because when you bring women together who have Artemis, the sisterhood archetype, as part of who they are, and we have the technical ability to communicate by all kinds of devices, we could have the rising up of a quality of feminism that feels like siblings with men, because this is Artemis also, not patriarchal, but brothers and sisters. Because Artemis was the firstborn of twins. Apollo was her twin brother. And what in her mythology she was concerned about was she came to the aid of her mother, she came to the aid of children, and she developed her own skills with the bow and arrow, plus the sense of goddess of the moon means that there's an element of mysticism. There is an enormous mystical element in nature if you tune into it. So I think that I would love it to see more and more Artemis rising, and so I'm doing that at the moment too.
Amazing.
Because activism is soul work when you're doing it from a space in which it's your journey and you're helping others.
Mm-hmm.
That's so beautiful. We just had the honor of chatting with Andrew Harvey last week, and he talks about sacred activism. So as you're saying this, it feels like there's such a hunger right now, I think, for this type of energy to emerge in larger numbers, and also for the elders, right? For the young seekers to connect with elders such as yourself, and to make sure that this wisdom isn't lost, that we don't have a disconnect with, just this lineage of experience and wisdom that's been passed down. Just to bring things to an end, is there anything you'd like to share as sort of last words for the next generation, of activists and seekers and curious souls?
Well, just in the last year, I started signing off on my emails with love, hope, perseverance, trust, and gratitude. And I think of it as a kind of a mantra. Love and hope are certainly obvious energies. Perseverance seems to be required to do anything that really matters to you, that to become a doctor and a Jungian analyst, psychiatrist. It took a lot of persevering through subjects that were hard or not interesting, but again, the Artemis idea that you can aim at a target that is far off. But if it's your target and you aim for it, then you tolerate what it takes to have setbacks, to have to do hard work, so perseverance. And then trust is much more the spiritual word. The word that means that you trust that it matters what you do with your one wild and precious life. You trust that there is a world of invisible spirits that you can call upon, that support you through some difficulties. You can count on prayer. You can count on a sense that there is a divinity that has that you have access to, even if you don't know very much about what it is, that it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Or that people that have died, then the whole tradition of the other side, that there are what are they, angels? Maybe they're angels, but that there's an invisible world that cares about what we do here too. That is trust. And the last is the motivation that can make us appreciate what we have, and that's gratitude.
Thank you so much. That's so beautiful to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
With gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Wow. Thank you. Allow the light of the sun to settle inside that open wound you hide. Allow the light. Let the soft nature of your heart, yes, the one you hide, be cleansed by every body of water the divine has gifted the earth and you. Let everyone witness the gifts a broken heart can offer, over and over, again and again. Allow the light to trickle into the dark and damp parts of you, because you are beautiful now. Join hands with those on the moonlit path. You will know that stories of pain are laughter in disguise. Let the belly laugh. Let the belly laugh.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Next week, we discuss the psychology of the inner teen with Avi Zuraviv. You can find links and show notes at soulspacepodcast.com. The best way to help us grow right now is to leave us a review on iTunes. Follow us on social at SoulspacePod. That's SoulspacePod. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Until next time.